There are moments in human history when the world forgets to breathe. Moments when darkness gives way to light, when silence gives birth to song, and when the human spirit, long chained by fear and faith, suddenly remembers its own power. This was one of those moments. 500 years ago, Europe awoke from its medieval sleep. From the quiet streets of Florence to the shimmering canals of Venice, from the sacred halls of Rome to the royal courts of France and England, a new fire was born. A fire of art, science, faith, and rebellion. It was an age of miracles created by man. Michelangelo carved eternity in marble. Leonardo da Vinci painted the soul of creation. Galileo lifted his eyes to the heavens and found infinity staring back. And through them all, a single truth emerged. That man himself was not the shadow of God's perfection. He was its reflection. This is the story of the Renaissance, the rebirth of Europe. A story of courage, genius, and transformation. A story that turned fear into curiosity, devotion into discovery, and faith into understanding. Where we bring the past to life with truth, emotion, and awe. Today, we journey through 20 chapters of light, through art and war, beauty and belief, reason and revolution to witness how the world was reborn. Prepare yourself for the era that made us who we are, because this is not just history. This is the beginning of everything. In the late Middle Ages, Europe was drowning in darkness. The Black Death had wiped out almost half of the continent's population. Cities that once buzzed with life now echoed with silence. Famine, war, and fear shaped human existence. Religion dominated every thought, and questioning the church was a crime punishable by death. Yet, amid this despair, change was quietly brewing. People began to ask, why must knowledge belong only to the clergy? Why should the soul be saved, but the mind left starved? Trade routes reopened, connecting Europe with the Islamic world and beyond. From the east came spices, silk, and, most importantly, ideas. Ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts, preserved by Arab scholars for centuries, found their way back to Europe. These texts whispered forgotten truths about geometry, astronomy, and philosophy. The intellectual embers of Plato, Aristotle, and Ptolemy reignited curious minds across Italy, France, and the Low Countries. The word Renaissance itself means rebirth. It wasn't just an era, it was a revolution of the spirit. As medieval walls cracked, human imagination surged forward. Florence, Venice, and Milan became vibrant centers of art and trade. The old feudal world was collapsing, replaced by merchants, artists, and thinkers who believed that man could shape his destiny through knowledge and beauty. Humanity was waking up again, stretching its limbs after centuries of slumber. This was the beginning of something extraordinary, a second dawn for civilization. If the Renaissance had a heart, it beat in Florence. In the 14th century, this small city in Tuscany grew into a beacon of creativity and wealth. The Arno River carried not just goods, but ideas. Banking families like the Medici transformed trade into power, funding artists, architects, and scientists. Under their patronage, Florence became a living canvas, its skyline rising with domes, sculptures, and frescoes that spoke of divine inspiration fused with human brilliance. Cosimo de' Medici, often called the father of the nation, sponsored scholars who searched for lost Greek and Roman texts. He built libraries, commissioned public art, and believed that beauty could lift the soul of a city. Artists no longer painted only for the church. They painted for humanity. The concept of humanism emerged. The belief that human reason, emotion, and creativity were worthy of exploration. In the narrow streets of Florence, Apprentices learned the art of perspective, anatomy, and proportion. Guilds of craftsmen and thinkers exchanged ideas in taverns and workshops. The Renaissance man was born, an individual skilled in many fields, seeking harmony between mind and hand. It was here that names like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo Buonarroti first found their spark. Florence was not merely a city. It was a living laboratory of genius, where the ancient world's wisdom met the bold ambitions of a new age. The true miracle of the Renaissance was not marble, paint, or parchment. It was the human mind rediscovering its power. For centuries, people had accepted that life's purpose was to serve God and await paradise. But now, thinkers proclaimed that divinity also resided in man himself. This radical idea inspired a cultural earthquake. Poets like Dante Alighieri redefined language. Petrarch searched ancient ruins for knowledge. Boccaccio captured the laughter and tears of real human lives. They turned their gaze from heaven to earth, celebrating the beauty of everyday existence. Education became a tool of liberation. Universities expanded, and scholars debated not only theology, but mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Printing, soon to be perfected by Gutenberg, spread these ideas faster than ever before. People began to read, question, and dream for themselves. Art mirrored this transformation. Faces in paintings now showed emotion. Landscapes glowed with realism. Even religious scenes reflected human depth. The Renaissance didn't reject faith, it rebalanced it. It taught that a person could love God and also explore the world he created. This harmony between science and spirit, reason and faith, was the foundation of Europe's rebirth. As cathedrals echoed with music and studios glimmered with paint, a single truth emerged. The human soul was infinite, and its light could never again be fully extinguished. The Middle Ages had ended, not with silence, but with song. In the shimmering heart of Renaissance Florence stood one man whose curiosity seemed larger than the world itself, Leonardo da Vinci. Born in 1452 in the small Tuscan town of Vinci, Leonardo grew up surrounded by hills, forests, and streams that later became his greatest teachers. He observed how water flowed, how birds moved, and how light danced upon the surface of the skin. To Leonardo, nature was not chaos. It was a divine machine waiting to be understood. His notebooks overflowed with sketches, flying machines, hydraulic systems, and the anatomy of the human body, each drawn with mathematical precision and artistic wonder. Leonardo was not merely an artist. He was the first true scientist of beauty. When he painted the Last Supper, he captured not only the faces of Christ and his disciples, but the very moment of emotional revelation, the shock, grief, and disbelief that spread like a wave through human hearts. In Mona Lisa, he gave the world a smile that has haunted centuries. That mysterious curve of her lips is not simply art. It is a mirror of the Renaissance soul itself. Calm, intelligent, infinitely curious. But Leonardo's genius was both a gift and a burden. He often left works unfinished, driven by new obsessions before old ones were complete. His restless intellect spanned anatomy, astronomy, architecture, and engineering. He dissected corpses to uncover the secrets of life and built sketches of helicopters centuries before flight was possible. Learning never exhausts the mind, he wrote, and indeed, his mind was inexhaustible. Through Leonardo, art and science embraced one another, and the Renaissance reached the height of its creative power. He proved that beauty was not separate from knowledge, but its truest expression. If Leonardo, was the dreamer. Michelangelo Buonarroti was the storm. Born in 1475 in Caprese, Italy, he carried within him a fierce and sacred fire. To Michelangelo, every block of marble contained a living spirit waiting to be freed. He once said, "I saw the angel in the marble and carved until I set him free." His hammer and chisel were his prayers, and every blow echoed with divine music. When he sculpted David, the young shepherd boy who defeated a giant, he was not merely shaping a biblical hero. He was sculpting the ideal of human courage, the power of intellect over brute strength. David stood as a symbol of Florence itself, small but fearless, beautiful yet strong. Michelangelo's art was monumental in scale and emotion. His frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome transformed painting into a cathedral of human form. There, from a scaffold, he lay on his back for years, painting scenes from Genesis, God's creation of Adam, the fall of man, the flood, and the judgment. Each muscular figure was alive with tension and grace. When his creation of Adam was unveiled, people gasped as if God himself had reached down to touch them. His figures were not ethereal angels, but men and women with flesh, bone, and emotion. Divine beings rendered human, human beings rendered divine. Michelangelo wrestled constantly between devotion and pride. He saw himself as both servant and rival of God, creating worlds with his hands, yet humbled by the perfection of his creator. His art embodied the Renaissance paradox. Faith and reason, heaven and earth, merged through human genius. His legacy proved that art could be as eternal as faith itself, that marble could breathe, and paint could speak the language of eternity. Amid the titans of the Renaissance, Raphael Sanzio of Urbino brought grace. Born in 1483, the youngest of the Great Trinity, Raphael's art was neither as experimental as Leonardo's nor as stormy as Michelangelo's. It was balanced, serene, and full of light. His paintings captured harmony itself, the union of divine order and human beauty. Trained under Perugino, Raphael absorbed the secrets of perspective, symmetry, and emotion. By his early 20s, he was already painting masterpieces in Florence, where he studied Leonardo's sfumato and Michelangelo's anatomy, blending their strengths into something uniquely his own. When Raphael arrived in Rome, his destiny met its stage. Commissioned by Pope Julius II, he decorated the stands di Raffaello, the papal chambers, with frescoes that turned walls into worlds. His masterpiece, The School of Athens, became the visual manifesto of humanism. In it, Plato and Aristotle stand at the center of an imagined gathering of history's greatest thinkers, mathematicians, philosophers, poets, all unified in one architectural paradise. Through geometry and gesture, Raphael captured the spirit of the Renaissance. Wisdom and art, faith and logic, coexisting in perfect symmetry. Raphael's charm extended beyond the canvas. He moved gracefully among popes, princes, and scholars, admired for his gentle spirit and intellect. His portraits radiated compassion. His Madonnas embodied maternal tenderness. But his brilliance was fleeting. He died at just 37, mourned by all of Rome. When his coffin was carried through the Vatican, even his unfinished painting, The Transfiguration, was placed beside him, a symbol that art itself grieved. In Raphael, the Renaissance found its perfect balance. Not the storm of Michelangelo, nor the mystery of Leonardo, but the peace of a world finally in harmony with itself. As the Renaissance matured, art had already painted the human soul in colors of divine brilliance. Yet another revolution was quietly unfolding. this time not on canvas or marble, but in the cosmos itself. For over 1,000 years, Europe had accepted the geocentric universe, Earth fixed at the center, heavens turning obediently around it. This idea, rooted in Aristotle and solidified by Ptolemy, was sanctioned by the Church as divine truth. To question it was to question God himself. But human curiosity, once awakened, cannot be chained. In 1473, in a small Polish town called Turynia, a child named Nicholas Copernicus was born, one who would shift the axis of human understanding. He grew up studying mathematics, medicine, and theology, yet it was the sky that held his heart. Night after night, he watched the stars and saw something that ancient models could not explain. Planets seemed to move backward in their paths, retrograde motion. This inconsistency gnawed at his reason. Could it be, he wondered, that the Earth was not the still center, but a traveler like the others? For decades, Copernicus refined his theory in secret. His book De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the celestial spheres, declared a truth both simple and terrifying. The Earth revolves around the Sun, published in 1543, the year of his death. It struck the world like lightning. The universe was no longer a divine stage with humanity at its center. It was vast, dynamic, and indifferent. Man was not the master of creation, but a small part of it. Yet this humility was not defeat, it was liberation. Science was no longer about repeating dogma. It was about seeking truth through reason. The heavens had opened, and for the first time, humankind dared to look without fear. Where Copernicus had whispered his truth, Galileo Galilei shouted it to the heavens. Born in Pisa in 1564, the same year Michelangelo died, Galileo inherited the flame of curiosity that burned through the Renaissance. As a young man, he challenged the old philosophers at the University of Padua, insisting that observation, not authority, was the path to knowledge. When he heard of a Dutch invention that made distant objects appear near, he improved it, creating his own telescope. With this humble tube of glass and metal, he changed the history of science forever. Through his telescope, Galileo saw a universe that no one had imagined. The moon was not smooth, but scarred with mountains and valleys. Jupiter had moons of its own, tiny worlds revolving around it. Venus showed phases like the moon, proving it orbited the sun, not Earth. The Milky Way, once thought to be a ghostly mist, was a sea of countless stars. Each discovery struck another blow to the ancient belief in a perfect, unchanging heaven. Galileo's writings, especially the Starry Messenger, 1610, spread across Europe like wildfire, inspiring wonder and fear alike. But the Church, threatened by these revelations, demanded silence. In 1633, Galileo was summoned before the Roman Inquisition. Under the shadow of torture, he was forced to renounce his belief in the heliocentric model. Kneeling, he muttered, "I abjure, I curse, I detest." Yet, as legend whispers, when he rose, he murmured the immortal words, "Eper esse move," and yet it moves. The earth, he meant, still circled the sun, no matter what men declared. Galileo's courage embodied the Renaissance spirit. Truth above fear, knowledge above obedience. Though confined, his ideas broke free, and the stars themselves bore witness to his defiance. The discoveries of Copernicus and Galileo did more than shift planets. They shifted perspective. Humanity's gaze turned outward and inward at once. The Renaissance man no longer sought salvation only through prayer, but also through exploration, experiment, and thought. The universe had become a vast book, written in the language of mathematics. Philosophy is written in this grand book, Galileo, said, "But it cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and interpret the characters in which it is written. It is written in the language of mathematics." This idea redefined the essence of truth. It was no longer enough to believe. One had to prove. Observation, logic, and evidence became sacred tools of inquiry. Across Europe, thinkers like Johannes Kepler, who deciphered the laws of planetary motion, and Francis Bacon, who pioneered the scientific method, built on Galileo's foundation. The Renaissance gave birth to the modern scientist, a seeker who combined imagination with discipline, wonder with rigor. And yet, science did not destroy faith, it refined it. To many Renaissance thinkers, uncovering the mechanisms of the cosmos was a way of admiring God's craftsmanship. The universe was not less divine because it obeyed laws. It was more divine, for those laws revealed an infinite intelligence at work. As telescopes grew stronger and minds sharper, the Renaissance spirit declared that ignorance was the true sin, and curiosity the purest form of worship. The Age of Reason had begun. Europe would never again sleep in the darkness of unchallenged belief. Humanity had reached for the stars and found itself among them. While artists painted divine beauty and scientists looked toward the stars, another revolution was brewing on Earth, one of power, intrigue, and human ambition. The Renaissance was not only a time of art and discovery, it was also an age of shifting kingdoms, assassinations, and betrayal. Italy, though radiant with culture, was divided into rival city-states: Florence, Venice, Milan, Rome, and Naples, each striving for dominance. Within their marble halls and candlelit chambers, politics became both an art and a battlefield. Alliances shifted like the tides, and loyalty was often just another word for opportunity. Florence, the jewel of Tuscany, had thrived under the Medici family, whose wealth and patronage built cathedrals and sponsored geniuses. But beneath that beauty lay tension. Factions fought for power, Republicans who dreamed of civic liberty, and oligarchs who sought control. The church itself was both a patron of art and a player in corruption. Popes waged wars, cardinals plotted, and kings used religion as a weapon. Out of this turbulence emerged a man whose pen was sharper than any sword: Niccolò Machiavelli. Born in 1469, Machiavelli served as a diplomat and official in Florence's Republican government. He traveled across Europe, meeting monarchs, soldiers, and spies. From these experiences, he saw the world as it truly was, not as moralists wished it to be, but as ambition made it. When the Medici returned to power in 1512, Machiavelli was dismissed, imprisoned, and tortured. In exile, he turned his pain into reflection, his disillusionment into doctrine. Alone in his small villa, by candlelight, he wrote the book that would redefine politics forever, The Prince. It was not a prayer for virtue, but a manual for survival. For Machiavelli, power was neither good nor evil. It was a force to be mastered, studied, and wielded. His Florence was a theater of human nature, and he dared to strip away the masks of morality to reveal the raw face of reality. When The Prince circulated across Italy, it shocked Europe's conscience. Here was a book that dared to tell rulers the truth they feared to hear. That politics was not about goodness, but effectiveness. Machiavelli observed that men were ungrateful, fickle, liars, and deceivers, and that a successful ruler must learn to act not only like a man, but, when necessary, like a beast. "It is better to be feared than loved," he wrote, "if you cannot be both." To his readers, this sounded heretical, a rejection of Christian virtue. But in reality, Machiavelli was not promoting cruelty. He was describing necessity. He argued that morality and politics must bow to the stability of the state. A prince who clung to idealism would be devoured by those who did not. What mattered was not purity of heart, but the preservation of power and peace. His heroes were not saints, but leaders. Cesare Borgia, Ferdinand of Aragon, and others who understood that the world rewards cunning more than kindness. Machiavelli dissected their methods like a surgeon, cool, precise, unsparing. He showed that deceit, strategy, and timing were the instruments of survival. To his contemporaries, the book was scandalous. The church banned it, popes condemned it, yet in secret, rulers read it by candlelight. Its influence spread through courts and empires, shaping generations of statesmen. In its pages, they found not evil, but clarity, a recognition that human nature is flawed and that governance must adapt to its imperfections. Machiavelli's realism became the seed of modern political thought. By teaching that stability and order might demand hard choices, he tore down the illusion of divine kingship and replaced it with something far more human. His was a mirror held to power, and what it reflected could not be unseen. Over time, Machiavelli's name became synonymous with deceit. Machiavellian came to mean cunning, manipulative, ruthless, yet few understood the man behind the myth. In truth, Machiavelli loved Florence deeply. He longed not for tyranny, but for a strong republic guided by wisdom and realism. In his later writings, such as Discourses on Livy, he celebrated liberty, civic virtue, and the power of collective governance. For him, politics was not about cruelty. It was about understanding the unpredictable dance between fortune and will. He believed that history moved in cycles, and that success came to those who could seize opportunity when it appeared. Fortune, he wrote, was like a woman. One must grasp her boldly, or she would favor others. This metaphor captured his worldview. Destiny favors the daring. He taught that humans are not helpless before fate. With intellect and courage, they can shape their world. That idea, though clothed in cold realism, was deeply Renaissance at heart. It placed human reason, not divine command, at the center of political life. Machiavelli's influence stretched far beyond Italy. His principles echoed in the writings of Thomas Hobbes, Richelieu, Frederick the Great, and even Napoleon Bonaparte. Modern political science was born from his observations. In every era since, leaders have faced his question: must a ruler be loved, or must he be feared? The answer, he suggested, depends on survival. His message was not a call to cruelty, but a warning. Power is a dangerous instrument, and those who hold it must understand its nature or be destroyed by it. In the grand theater of the Renaissance, where art sang of beauty and science revealed truth, Machiavelli gave voice to the darker poetry of power. He showed that humanity's rebirth was not only painted in light, but also shaped by shadow. For every masterpiece that adorned a chapel, there was a calculation that preserved a throne. The Renaissance was not just a triumph of creativity. It was a lesson in control, and Machiavelli wrote its most unflinching chapter. For centuries, knowledge in Europe lived within the hands of a privileged few. Books were treasures, painstakingly copied by monks in dimly lit monasteries, written on parchment with quills dipped in ink. Each page was a labor of love, sometimes taking months to complete. A single Bible could cost as much as a small house. To own one was a symbol of divine favor or aristocratic power. But to the common man, knowledge was a locked gate, guarded by wealth, hierarchy, and illiteracy. The Renaissance, with its hunger for learning, demanded a key, and that key came from a mind of one man, Johannes Gutenberg. Born around 1400 in Mainz, Germany, Gutenberg was a craftsman, a metalsmith, and a dreamer. He understood something the scholars did not. That knowledge must not only be discovered but distributed. Around 1440, he began experimenting with movable type, tiny metal letters that could be rearranged, inked, and pressed on a paper. What had once been written by hand could now be replicated by machine. His invention was more than a technological marvel. It was a social earthquake. The first great product of this revolution was his masterpiece, the Gutenberg Bible, completed around 1455. It was beautiful, precise, and infinitely reproducible. For the first time in human history, the written word was no longer the domain of elites. Books multiplied, ideas traveled faster than armies, and knowledge began to escape the control of kings and popes. The printing press turned thought into a weapon. It democratized information, transforming Europe from a continent of listeners into a continent of readers. This was not merely an invention. It was a rebirth of communication, the foundation upon which the modern world would be built. The ripple that began in Gutenberg's workshop spread across Europe like wildfire. Within decades, printing presses appeared in Italy, France, England, and the Low Countries. By 1500, more than 20 million books had been printed. Universities overflowed with students clutching volumes that once would have been unreachable. Literacy rates climbed, and with them, the power of thought itself. The Renaissance hunger for wisdom found its perfect messenger in the press. Scholars like Erasmus of Rotterdam and Thomas More harnessed the power of print to critique society, religion, and politics. Their writings circulated in taverns, universities, and royal courts alike. No longer could the church control every narrative or censor every thought. Translations of the Bible into German, English, and French allowed people to read holy texts in their own tongues. The Word of God was no longer mediated by priests. It was spoken directly to the people. This revolution of access ignited the flames of Reformation. The press also gave rise to public debate. Pamphlets, letters, and manifestos turned into weapons of persuasion. Philosophers could challenge kings. Scientists could publish discoveries. Poets could immortalize love and loss. Even artists like Albrecht Dürer used engraving and print to replicate their masterpieces for a wider audience. Knowledge became a living organism, evolving and reproducing beyond borders. For the first time, the world's ideas began to belong to everyone, not just the few. The printing press transformed Europe into a single, interconnected mind. It united distant thinkers under a shared pursuit of truth. What fire and sword could not achieve, what centuries of conquest had failed to accomplish, was achieved by ink and paper. Civilization had found its voice, and that voice would never again be silent. The true magic of the printing press was not in metal or ink, but in the awakening it caused within the human soul. Every printed page was an act of rebellion against ignorance. It invited the ordinary man to think, to question, to imagine. The Renaissance ideal of the thinking individual found its foundation in this revolution. The spread of books nurtured humanism, encouraging readers to see themselves as capable of reason, morality, and creativity. The written word became a bridge between art and science, faith and doubt, the past and the future. With the press, the works of Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero were reborn. Artists studied anatomy manuals. Astronomers read the theories of Copernicus. Explorers carried printed maps across oceans. A new culture of exchange emerged, one that valued evidence over superstition, logic over blind faith. The printing press was not just a tool, it was an engine of progress. But this freedom came with consequence. Censorship rose as swiftly as literacy. Monarchs and popes feared the wildfire of dissent. Books were banned, burned, and condemned, yet each flame only kindled more curiosity. Ideas once confined to scholars now reached farmers, merchants, and sailors. The marketplace of thought was open to all, and truth became the most powerful currency. In time, this revolution would fuel others, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and even the Enlightenment. Every revolution of the modern world, from democracy to science to art, can trace its roots back to Gutenberg's humble press. It was more than a machine. It was a mirror reflecting humanity's hunger to know. The Renaissance taught mankind how to dream, but Gutenberg gave it the power to share those dreams forever. As presses clattered in the night and ink stained the hands of printers, a new age dawned. An age where thought could no longer be silenced, and words could change the world. Before the Renaissance, Europe's intellectual sky was dim, dominated by theology and dogma. Knowledge was filtered through the church, and man was seen merely as a vessel for divine will. But beneath the surface, change was stirring. From the dusty monasteries of Italy to the bustling universities of Paris, scholars began to rediscover the forgotten treasures of ancient Greece and Rome. Scrolls that had slept for centuries. Works by Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, and Virgil were unearthed, translated, and studied with a sense of awe. These texts whispered a radical message: that man was not powerless before fate, but capable of greatness through reason, virtue, and learning. This revival of classical wisdom birthed humanism, a movement that placed man not as a rival to God, but as his most noble creation, endowed with intellect and free will. Humanists believed that understanding the world was not blasphemy, it was reverence. To study the body was to appreciate divine craftsmanship. To explore nature was to witness God's logic in motion. It was a philosophy that married faith with curiosity, soul with science. Cities like Florence, Padua, and Venice became sanctuaries for scholars. Libraries swelled with manuscripts, and academies bloomed. Petrarch, often called the father of humanism, led the charge. He searched the ruins of old monasteries for lost Latin texts and wrote of man's inner struggles, desires, and potential. To Petrarch, the human heart was as worthy of exploration as the stars. "I am a human being," he wrote, "and nothing human is alien to me." His words became the anthem of a new worldview, one where the dignity of man was as sacred as the Word of God. The Middle Ages had bowed before mystery. The Renaissance stood up and said, "I think, I feel, I am." Humanism was not a single school of thought. It was a chorus of voices, each singing the beauty of human potential. In Florence, Coluccio Salutati and Leonardo Bruni championed the study of classical rhetoric and history, believing that wisdom from the past could guide the future. In England, Thomas More imagined an ideal society in utopia, where justice and reason triumphed over greed. Across Europe, teachers urged students to read not just to memorize, but to understand, question, and improve. Education became an act of liberation, not obedience. The printing press amplified this awakening. Works like Erasmus's In Praise of Folly used humor and wit to challenge corruption in both church and state. Erasmus believed that morality came not from fear of punishment, but from love of truth. His humanism was rooted in compassion, a belief that man's greatest power lay in kindness and reason. Artists, too, absorbed these ideals. Painters began to portray saints and scholars not as distant icons, but as living, breathing humans with emotion and thought. Sculptors studied anatomy to reveal the perfection of God's design in the human form. The human body, once viewed as sinful flesh, became a symbol of divine beauty. In universities, students debated Aristotle alongside scripture. Scholars like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola explored philosophy, mysticism, and science, proclaiming that human beings were creatures of unlimited potential. Pico's oration on the dignity of man became the manifesto of the Renaissance mind. Man is the molder and maker of himself. To the humanists, this was the essence of existence, to learn, to create, and to transcend the limits of ignorance. Knowledge was no longer the privilege of the few. It was the birthright of humanity. The mind of Europe had awakened, and it refused to sleep again. The rise of humanism transformed more than classrooms. It transformed civilization itself. Art, literature, and politics began to reflect a new faith in human agency. Churches were painted with saints who looked like neighbors. Poetry spoke of love not as sin, but as beauty. Architecture embraced harmony, proportion, and light. The cathedral was no longer the only temple of inspiration. The human mind became one too. Everywhere, the question echoed, what does it mean to be human? The answer, according to the Renaissance, was not obedience but creativity. To be human was to think, to feel, to shape one's destiny. This philosophy redefined education, government, and morality. Citizens were encouraged to participate in civic life, to discuss, to reason. Florence's republic thrived on this ideal, the belief that wisdom, not birthright, should guide leadership. Even religion itself evolved. Many clergy adopted humanist teachings, seeing them not as threats, but as complements to faith. This age was not free from contradictions. The same hands that painted angels also built canons. The same presses that printed Bibles also spread heresy. Yet through it all, the Renaissance clung to one radiant truth, that mankind was worthy of hope. From the painter's brush to the philosopher's pen, from the architect's compass to the scientist's telescope, every act of creation became an act of affirmation. That life, knowledge, and imagination were sacred gifts. By the dawn of the 16th century, Europe had rediscovered itself. The rediscovery of classical wisdom had not resurrected the past. It had reborn humanity itself. The people who once bowed in fear before the unknown now gazed upon the stars with wonder and confidence. The human heart had become the new frontier of exploration. The Renaissance did not just rebuild Europe's cities, it rebuilt the human spirit. By the late 15th century, the Renaissance spirit that had awakened Europe's art and intellect now ignited another human hunger, the desire to explore, to know what lay beyond the horizon. For centuries, the world map of Europe had been small, confined by fear and legend. Beyond the edges of the known world were painted monsters, demons, and oceans that fell off into the void. Yet the Renaissance had changed the mind of man. No longer content to repeat old tales, people now wanted proof. The same curiosity that made Leonardo dissect corpses and Galileo study the stars drove sailors to brave unknown seas. Trade was the first spark. The Silk Road, which once connected Europe to the riches of Asia, had grown perilous after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. The Ottoman Empire controlled key routes, choking Europe's access to spices, silk, and precious stones. But necessity is the mother of invention, and Europe's merchants and monarchs began dreaming of reaching Asia by sea. To them, the ocean was not a barrier, but a bridge yet to be crossed. In Portugal, Prince Henry the Navigator led the charge. He gathered mapmakers, sailors, and astronomers at his school in Sagres, creating the world's first navigation hub. New inventions, the compass, the astrolabe, and improved ship designs like the caravel made longer voyages possible. Portuguese explorers crept down the coast of Africa, mapping lands that had only been rumor. One by one, they discovered the islands of Madeira, Cape Verde, and the route around the Cape of Good Hope. When Vasco da Gama finally reached India in 1498, the impossible had become real. The age of discovery had begun, not merely as a quest for wealth, but as a declaration of the Renaissance mind that the world was vast, mysterious, and conquerable through knowledge and courage. In Spain, another dreamer prepared to change history forever. Christopher Columbus, a Genoese sailor inspired by Marco Polo's tales and Ptolemy's maps, believed that by sailing west he could reach the riches of the East. Many dismissed his plan as madness. The ocean beyond Europe was feared as endless, haunted, and deadly. Yet Queen Isabella of Castile saw in Columbus a glimmer of destiny. In 1492, she granted him 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and a crew of men who carried with them both faith and fear. As the ships sailed into the Atlantic, every creak of timber and crash of wave tested their resolve. Weeks passed with no land in sight. The crew murmured rebellion, believing they'd sailed too far into nothingness. Then, on October 12th, 1492, a cry pierced the night. Tierra, tierra, land. They had reached an island in the Bahamas, though Columbus believed he had arrived in Asia. In truth, he had stumbled upon a world unknown to Europe, the Americas. That single voyage redrew the map of human history. It united continents that had never met and unleashed a wave of exploration, conquest, and exchange that would reshape civilization forever. Gold, silver, and new crops like maize and potatoes began flowing into Europe. But with them came disease, slavery, and death to the native peoples. The age of discovery was a double-edged sword, one side shining with progress, the other dripping with suffering. Still, the courage of Columbus marked the turning point between the medieval and the modern. His voyage was not just geographical, it was psychological. It proved that Earth was not a flat prison of fear, but a round world waiting to be known. For the Renaissance mind, this was the final confirmation of its creed. There are no limits, only horizons. The fire of discovery, once lit, could not be contained. After Columbus came a new generation of explorers who turned the dream of a connected world into a living reality. Among them stood Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese navigator whose courage redefined the meaning of distance and endurance. In 1519, under the Spanish crown, Magellan set sail with 5 ships, determined to find a westward route to the Spice Islands. His journey would become one of the greatest epics in human history. The fleet braved tempests, mutinies, and starvation as it carved a path through the southern tip of South America, through the dangerous strait that now bears his name. When they finally reached the Pacific Ocean, Magellan's crew faced months of endless sea. Men died of hunger and disease. Ships were lost. Yet through unimaginable suffering, they pressed on. Though Magellan himself was killed in the Philippines, one of his ships, the Victoria, returned to Spain in 1522. It had completed the first circumnavigation of the Earth, proving beyond doubt that the planet was one continuous world. This revelation changed everything. Maps were redrawn, trade exploded, and Europe's view of itself shifted forever. No longer the isolated center of creation, it was part of a vast global system, connected by sea, commerce, and destiny. The discoveries brought immense wealth to Europe's crowns and merchants, but they also unleashed the age of colonization and exploitation. The Renaissance dream of knowledge had found its cost in blood and conquest. Yet in another sense, the Age of Discovery fulfilled humanity's oldest longing to know what lay beyond the horizon. It symbolized the Renaissance belief that man could master his fears and transform the unknown into understanding. Every compass, every map, every voyage whispered the same truth. The earth was not the limit of man's ambition, but the beginning of his journey. For centuries, the Roman Catholic Church stood as the unchallenged authority of the Western world. It crowned kings, owned vast lands, and held the keys to heaven, or so people believed. From the grand cathedrals of Rome to the smallest village chapels, faith ruled every aspect of life. But beneath the gilded crosses and Latin chants, corruption festered. Popes waged wars, priests sold indulgences, promises of forgiveness for gold, and monasteries overflowed with wealth while peasants starved. The church, once a refuge of souls, had become a fortress of power. The Renaissance, however, had changed Europe's way of thinking. Humanism had taught people to read, reason, and question. Printing had given them access to scripture and philosophy in their own languages. The seeds of rebellion were sown not in anger, but in awakening. People began to ask dangerous questions. If God is merciful, why must salvation be bought? If faith is pure, why is it buried under gold? The authority of the church trembled beneath the weight of reason. In Germany, a young monk named Martin Luther found himself haunted by doubt. Despite his devotion, he could not silence the question in his soul. Could human deeds truly earn salvation, or was it God's grace alone that saved mankind? His search for truth led him deep into Scripture, where he found answers that contradicted centuries of church teaching. In 1517, angered by the sale of indulgences by the priest Johann Tetzel, Luther struck a spark that would ignite all of Europe. On October 31st, he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church, a list of challenges to the church's authority and corruption. The hammer that struck that nail echoed louder than any bell in Christendom. It was the sound of rebellion, not against faith, but for its purification. The age of unquestioned belief had ended. Martin Luther's words spread faster than wildfire, carried by the printing press across every corner of Europe. For the first time, ordinary people read his ideas for themselves. His message was simple, yet revolutionary. Faith alone saves. Salvation, he declared, was a gift of God, not something to be bought or earned. The Bible, not the Pope, was the ultimate authority. Every believer had the right to read it in their own tongue, to know God personally without priestly intermediaries. The church's response was swift and furious. Luther was branded a heretic and summoned to defend his faith before the emperor at the Diet of Worms in 1521. Surrounded by power, he refused to recant. "Here I stand," he declared. "I can do no other. God help me." With those words, he defied the mightiest institution on earth. He was excommunicated, outlawed, and forced into hiding, but his ideas could no longer be silenced. Across Europe, others joined the cause. In Switzerland, Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin built their own movements, each interpreting the scriptures through reason and conviction. The Protestant Reformation, as it came to be called, fractured Europe's spiritual unity but revived its moral conscience. The Bible was translated into German, English, and French, allowing millions to read what had once been forbidden. Education expanded. Literacy became a weapon of faith. But this awakening also brought conflict. Kingdoms split, neighbors turned against neighbors, and entire nations were torn apart in the name of God. The wars of religion that followed claimed millions of lives. Yet they also birthed a new ideal, that conscience could not be chained and truth could not be owned. The Reformation was not just a battle for belief. It was a revolution of the soul, one that made faith personal and knowledge sacred. The Catholic Church, shaken but not destroyed, rose to defend itself in what became known as the Counter-Reformation. Realizing that the only way to survive was to reform from within, it summoned the Council of Trent in 1545. For nearly 2 decades, bishops, cardinals, and theologians debated doctrine, discipline, and corruption. The Church reaffirmed its traditional teachings but also sought renewal, ending many abuses and revitalizing the clergy. Out of crisis came introspection. Out of arrogance came humility. New spiritual orders emerged to fight ignorance and spread faith through education. The Jesuits, founded by Ignatius of Loyola, became the intellectual army of the Church, building schools, missions, and universities across the world. Their motto, Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam, for the greater glory of God, symbolized a faith reborn through discipline and service. Art, too, became a weapon of devotion. The Baroque style, born in this era, filled churches with drama, light, and emotion, reminding believers that beauty was also a path to the divine. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation reshaped Europe not just spiritually, but politically. Princes chose religions for their realms. Nations drew borders along lines of belief. Yet beneath the turmoil, something profound had changed forever: the individual's relationship with God. Faith was no longer dictated by kings or priests. It became a matter of conscience. By the end of the 16th century, Europe stood transformed. The Church had lost its monopoly on truth, but Christianity itself had been reborn. Out of division came diversity. Out of rebellion came renewal. The Renaissance had begun as a rebirth of knowledge, but now it had reached the soul itself. Humanity had not only rediscovered the power of art and science, it had rediscovered the power of belief. The printing press had spread words, but the Reformation had spread freedom of thought. The Renaissance was not only an age of artists and philosophers, it was also an age of kings. As Europe emerged from medieval chaos, power began to shift, from feudal lords and local dukes to centralized monarchs who dreamed of building strong, unified nations. The rise of these rulers reshaped the political map of Europe and set the stage for the modern state. Their courts became theaters of ambition, where alliances were sealed in marriage, war, and betrayal. In France, Louis XI, known as the Spider King, wove his web of power with cunning diplomacy, binding the fractious nobles to his crown. His successors transformed France into one of Europe's strongest monarchies. In Spain, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile united their kingdoms through marriage, creating a single Catholic monarchy that expelled Muslim rulers from Granada in 1492, the same year Columbus discovered the New World under their flag. Their union forged not only a new nation, but a global empire that would stretch across oceans. England, too, was changing. The bloody Wars of the Roses had ended with the victory of Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. He brought stability to a nation ravaged by decades of civil war. His son, Henry VIII, would transform England further, not through conquest, but through defiance of the Church itself. Across the continent, monarchs began to realize that divine right could be wielded as both sword and shield. The old medieval idea of fragmented feudalism gave way to centralized administration, national identity, and the first modern bureaucracies. These rulers were not merely kings. They were architects of destiny. They used Renaissance ideals, order, rationality, and human ambition to shape politics into an art. Under their rule, Europe began to breathe as nations rather than fiefdoms. The balance of power was being rewritten, and the age of the monarch had truly begun. Few monarchs embodied the drama of Renaissance kingship like Henry VIII of England. Charismatic, brilliant, and ruthless, he began his reign in 1509 as a devout Catholic and ally of the Pope. But beneath the gold and ceremony burned a man unwilling to be denied his desires. When the Pope refused to grant him a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, Henry did the unthinkable. He severed England from the authority of Rome. In 1534, through the Act of Supremacy, he declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, forever changing the course of history. This bold act was not merely personal rebellion. It was a political revolution. For the first time, a monarch placed the crown above the cross, the state above the papacy. Monasteries were dissolved, their wealth seized, and lands redistributed to loyal nobles. The Reformation in England became as much about power as piety. Henry's court became a labyrinth of intrigue. Wives executed, ministers betrayed, and alliances shattered. Yet beneath the chaos lay a vision. A strong, independent England, free from foreign influence. Henry's actions inspired fear and admiration across Europe. Some saw him as a tyrant, others as a hero of sovereignty. His daughter, Elizabeth I, would later perfect what he began, turning England into a cultural and naval power that defined the next century. Under her rule, the arts flourished, trade expanded, and Shakespeare's words gave voice to a nation's soul. The Tudors transformed England from a minor island kingdom into the heart of a global empire. Henry's legacy was paradoxical. He had split Christendom, crushed dissent, and ruled with iron. Yet he had also birthed the modern concept of national independence. The Renaissance had taught men to question the heavens. Henry taught them to question kings, and even to become kings in their own right. As the 16th century unfolded, the monarchs of Europe grew ever stronger. The chaos of medieval feudalism was replaced by a new vision: absolutism, the belief that kings ruled by divine right and answered only to God. This philosophy found its most glittering expression in France, under King Francis I and later Louis XIV, the Sun King. Their courts were not merely centers of politics, but of art, fashion, and intellect. Power was expressed through architecture and ceremony. The splendor of palaces like Versailles became a visual language of authority. In these royal courts, the Renaissance ideals of order and beauty merged with control and spectacle. Nobles were drawn into the orbit of the king, their privileges bought by proximity. The monarch became not just a ruler, but a symbol, the living embodiment of the state. L'État, c'est moi, said Louis XIV. I am the state. His reign set the standard for kingship across Europe, inspiring awe and envy alike. Meanwhile, elsewhere, the balance of power began to shift. In Spain, the riches of the New World filled the coffers of Charles V and Philip II, funding wars that sought to defend Catholicism and expand empire. Yet such wealth also bred decadence and inflation, sowing the seeds of decline. In contrast, nations like England and the Netherlands embraced trade and exploration, balancing monarchy with emerging civic institutions. The Renaissance spirit of individuality began to infiltrate governance itself. By the end of the 16th century, Europe had become a stage of magnificent rulers and restless people. Monarchs claimed divine authority, yet the humanist ideals of liberty and inquiry whispered in the shadows. The tension between power and freedom, between throne and mind, would shape the centuries to come. The Renaissance had given birth to both the king and the citizen, the crown and the conscience, and their struggle would define modern history. The age of monarchs was dazzling, but it was also fragile. For in every empire's glitter lay the seeds of revolution. In the grand paintings, marble sculptures, and libraries of the Renaissance, the spotlight often falls upon men, kings, artists, and thinkers. Yet behind the scenes, and sometimes in defiance of their times, women shaped this rebirth with courage, intellect, and grace. In a world ruled by patriarchs and priests, the Renaissance woman had to fight not only for recognition, but for existence in the realm of ideas. While men debated philosophy in universities and painted ceilings for popes, women were often confined to domestic walls. But within those walls, a revolution of the mind was quietly blooming. In Florence, Venice, and Paris, women of noble families began to receive education, studying Latin, poetry, and even philosophy. The printing press made books accessible, and literacy spread among the privileged classes. Isata Nagarola, one of the earliest female humanists, challenged the notion that women were intellectually inferior. Her writings argued that virtue and intellect were not determined by gender, but by effort and wisdom. In her letters, she debated theology with male scholars, sometimes silencing them with logic sharper than any sword. Across Italy, Cassandra Fedele emerged as a public speaker whose eloquence dazzled scholars and statesmen alike. Her orations celebrated learning as the highest form of human dignity. In Ferrara, Lucrezia Borgia, long maligned by rumor, proved to be not merely a pawn of papal politics, but a capable ruler and patron of the arts. Women like her used diplomacy, culture, and intellect as weapons in a world where swords were denied them. The Renaissance woman was more than muse or mother. She was a mind reborn. Through poetry, governance, and art, she claimed her place in humanity's awakening. She whispered where men shouted, but her words echoed through centuries. As kingdoms rose and empires expanded, some women seized the reins of authority, proving that intelligence and leadership knew no gender. Among them, none shone brighter than Queen Isabella of Castile, whose vision unified Spain and financed Columbus's voyage that changed the course of the world. She ruled not as a figurehead, but as a sovereign, decisive, devout, and fiercely intelligent. Her policies strengthened Spain's administration and turned it into a global power. But her reign also bore shadows, with the Spanish Inquisition marking one of history's darkest chapters. Isabella embodied the Renaissance paradox: faith and progress, light and shadow entwined. In France, Catherine de' Medici, born into the powerful Florentine family, married into the French royal house, and brought with her the splendor of Italian culture. As queen and later regent, she navigated the violent religious wars that tore France apart, using cunning diplomacy to maintain stability. Though history often paints her in intrigue, Catherine was a master strategist in an age when survival required intellect as sharp as any blade. And in England, the Renaissance found its brightest female flame, Elizabeth I, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth inherited a kingdom divided by religion and threatened by invasion. Through brilliance, restraint, and charisma, she forged an era that bore her name, the Elizabethan Age. She fostered the arts, encouraged exploration, and balanced Protestant and Catholic factions with statesmanlike grace. Under her reign, England transformed into a cultural and naval powerhouse. She became a living symbol of sovereignty, independence, and intellect. A woman who ruled not as a queen of hearts, but as a queen of minds. These rulers proved that power and wisdom were not bound by gender. They were the torchbearers of a new vision of womanhood, one where leadership was defined not by birthright alone, but by brilliance and resolve. Beyond palaces and thrones, another revolution unfolded. The intellectual awakening of women in the arts and sciences. As universities slowly opened their doors and printing spread ideas, women began to publish, paint, and philosophize. Their voices, though often censored or forgotten, became the foundation of modern thought. Christine de Pizan, a French writer of the early 1400s, became one of Europe's first professional female authors. In the Book of the City of Ladies, she constructed an allegorical city where women of virtue, courage, and intellect could dwell, free from male prejudice. Her work was a bold declaration that history itself had ignored women's contributions, and she vowed to rewrite it. Centuries before feminism had a name, Christine planted its first seed. Artists, too, emerged from the shadows. Sofonisba Anguissola, an Italian painter, broke barriers by earning international fame for her portraits. She was admired by Michelangelo himself, and later served as a court artist to the Spanish crown. Her work portrayed women not as passive beauties, but as thinkers, musicians, and dreamers, reflections of a new consciousness. In Venice, Veronica Franco, both poet and courtesan, challenged the moral hypocrisy of her time through poetry that combined sensuality with intellect. She wrote fearlessly about female desire and dignity, reminding society that women were neither saints nor sinners, but human beings deserving of voice and respect. These women, through pen, brush, and reason, carved their legacy into the Renaissance. They did not merely follow the age's spirit, they expanded it. They proved that rebirth was not only a matter of art and science, but of identity and equality. Those centuries would pass before their full recognition. Their courage lit the first fires of the movement that would one day demand true human freedom. The Renaissance man might have conquered the world with invention and reason, but the Renaissance woman taught it how to feel, to nurture, and to think beyond limits. Together, they completed the rebirth of humanity, a Europe awakened to art, science, and philosophy. Another transformation unfolded across its blood-stained fields, the rebirth of war itself. The Renaissance did not only paint angels, it forged cannons. It did not only write poetry, it wrote the rules of empire. The medieval knight in shining armor, the gallant symbol of chivalry, was becoming obsolete. Gunpowder, brought from the East centuries earlier, had matured into a weapon that changed the very meaning of courage. No longer did noble birth guarantee victory. Now it was technology, discipline, and strategy that decided the fate of kingdoms. By the 15th century, armies were evolving into organized machines. Soldiers were trained, drilled, and paid. Not mere peasants drafted in desperation, but professionals of war. The old feudal levy gave way to standing armies, loyal to the crown rather than to local lords. Iron and fire replaced valor and steel. Cannons shattered castle walls that had stood for centuries, and the thunder of muskets drowned the songs of knights. The age of romantic warfare was ending. The age of modern warfare had begun. Italy became the testing ground of this transformation. Its city-states, Florence, Venice, Milan, and Naples, warred endlessly, not only with swords, but with intelligence. The condottieri, professional mercenary captains, turned battle into business. Men like Francesco Sforza and Bartolomeo Colleoni mastered the art of maneuver, deception, and siege. Warfare was no longer about blind bravery. It was about calculation. Armies moved like chess pieces across the landscape, guided by minds that valued precision over passion. The Renaissance, for all its love of beauty, taught Europe a cruel but essential truth. The art of war was also the art of survival. Every cannon fired in Italy echoed across the continent, shaping a new political order built not only on culture, but on control. AS weapons grew deadlier. Rulers discovered another battlefield. One fought not with steel, but with silence, persuasion, and pen. Diplomacy became the invisible hand of Renaissance politics. Monarchs and republics alike sent ambassadors to rival courts, not as mere messengers, but as professional negotiators. They carried secrets, promises, and lies in equal measure. The balance of power, that delicate web connecting nations, was now maintained through strategy as intricate as any painting or fresco. In Italy, where city-states balanced on the edge of constant rivalry, diplomacy reached its finest form. Francesco Guicciardini and Niccolò Machiavelli understood that politics was war by other means. Alliances were fragile, betrayals expected. Treaties were written not for peace, but for positioning. The rise of the Italian diplomatic system, permanent embassies, coded correspondence, and professional envoys, would become the model for all of Europe. Venice, the master of intrigue, perfected this craft. Its ambassadors reported every whisper, every rumor, every move of foreign courts. The Venetian Senate, armed with intelligence rather than swords, could outmaneuver empires. Diplomacy became an art of patience and illusion. The ambassador had to be actor, scholar, linguist, and spy. He must flatter kings while deceiving them, speak truth in half sentences, and lie with elegance. War might destroy cities, but words could destroy empires. The Renaissance diplomat knew that information was the most valuable weapon of all. It was through such diplomacy that Europe began to form the first international order, where nations negotiated peace and power without constant bloodshed. It was imperfect and fragile, but it laid the foundation of modern geopolitics. The Renaissance taught mankind that survival required more than courage. It demanded intelligence. A sword could win a battle, but a letter could win a century. Be why the late 16th century, warfare itself had evolved into a science of geometry, physics, and human behavior. No longer was the battlefield ruled by luck or superstition. It was ruled by minds capable of calculation. Mathematicians sketched blueprints for fortresses. Engineers designed cannons with deadly precision. Renaissance generals began to study terrain, supply lines, and morale. Victory belonged to those who could see patterns in chaos. The Italian engineer Leon Battista Alberti wrote about proportion in art and architecture, but his ideas influenced fortress design. This star fort, with angled bastions and defensive lines, emerged as the perfect answer to cannon fire. This architectural genius, blending beauty with brutality, symbolized the Renaissance obsession with balance, even in war. Thinkers like Machiavelli, in The Art of War, 1521, argued that armies must be disciplined and citizen-based, not mercenary. He warned that fortune favored those who prepared, studied, and adapted. His writings were not about glorifying violence, but about understanding power as a living force, something that could be predicted, controlled, and used. Generals from France to the Holy Roman Empire absorbed these lessons. Maurice of Nassau in the Netherlands introduced rigorous drill formations and coordinated musket volleys, early steps toward the military professionalism that would dominate the modern age. The Renaissance strategist no longer fought for glory alone, but for order in chaos. War had become an extension of philosophy, cold, logical, yet deeply human. It mirrored the age's faith in reason, that even destruction could be mastered through intellect. But beneath the discipline and geometry lay the same truth that haunted all Renaissance creations: that progress, without conscience, comes with a price. As Europe's cannons thundered and treaties trembled, the continent stood at a crossroads between creation and ruin. The same hands that painted masterpieces and printed Bibles also built armies and carved empires. The Renaissance was the birth of genius, but also the dawn of modern power. If the Renaissance had a soul, it was Florence. Nestled along the Arno River, this Tuscan city was not the largest, nor the most powerful, but it was the cradle of creativity. Its narrow streets echoed with the footsteps of artists, philosophers, bankers, and poets who dared to believe that beauty could transform the world. Florence was a paradox, humble in size, yet infinite in influence. At its heart stood the Medici family, merchant bankers who turned their wealth into the engine of progress. Cosimo de' Medici, the family patriarch, invested in art and intellect rather than conquest. Under his patronage, libraries grew, artists thrived, and scholars rediscovered the ancient wisdom of Greece and Rome. He believed that culture was the highest form of wealth, and Florence became his masterpiece. His grandson, Lorenzo the Magnificent, carried this vision further, gathering poets like Poliziano, philosophers like Marsilio Ficino, and artists like Botticelli and Leonardo da Vinci under his protection. Their works reflected a city that was not only alive with color, but with purpose. The skyline of Florence embodied the Renaissance spirit. The Duomo, designed by Filippo Brunelleschi, rose like a miracle of mathematics and faith, its dome defying medieval engineering. The Uffizi Palace, built by Giorgio Vasari, became a temple to art and governance. The city's workshops and studios pulsed with energy, where stone turned into living flesh and pigment turned into emotion. But beyond its beauty, Florence symbolized something deeper: the triumph of human imagination. Here, artisans became legends, and money became meaning. The city proved that greatness was not born of empire or conquest, but of vision. Florence was not merely a place. It was a philosophy, the living proof that a city devoted to art and knowledge could rival the glory of ancient Rome. If Florence was the mind of the Renaissance, Venice was its shimmering heart. Rising from the waters of the Adriatic like a dream, Venice was a city unlike any other, built not on land but on courage. Its founders had fled barbarian invasions centuries earlier, seeking refuge among the lagoons. Out of mud and sea, they built a republic that would become the envy of the world. By the 15th century, Venice was Europe's richest trading power. Its ships ruled the Mediterranean, bringing silks from China, spices from India, and gold from Africa. But Venice's true genius was not merely in commerce, it was in balance. Governed by an intricate system of councils, senators, and the Doge, Venice maintained a fragile harmony between aristocracy and freedom. Its diplomacy was unmatched, its spies legendary, its stability almost mythical. While kingdoms rose and fell, Venice endured, serene and eternal. The city itself was a masterpiece. The Doge's palace, with its lace-like Gothic facade, spoke of elegance and power. The Piazza San Marco, dominated by the basilica's golden domes, shimmered like a gateway between east and west. Venetian artists like Titian, Bellini, and Tintoretto captured the light of the lagoon, turning it into paint that seemed alive. Music and masks filled the city's air, mystery and freedom intertwined. But Venice was more than beauty. It was innovation. It pioneered printing, shipbuilding, and global trade. It showed that prosperity could come not from conquest, but from creativity and connection. The city floated upon water, yet it stood for stability. It faced the sea, yet it gazed toward the world. In Venice, humanity proved that ingenuity could turn fragility into strength. It was the Renaissance dream made real, a city where every reflection upon the canal was a reflection upon human brilliance. If Florence gave birth to the Renaissance and Venice sustained it, Rome crowned it with glory. By the early 1500s, the Eternal City, once the heart of a fallen empire, was reborn as the center of divine and artistic power. The popes of the Renaissance, ambitious, cultured, and often controversial, saw themselves not just as spiritual leaders, but as emperors of beauty. Under their rule, Rome became the workshop of the divine. Pope Nicholas V, Julius II, and Leo X envisioned a city that would rival the grandeur of ancient times. They called upon the greatest minds of their age, Bramante, Raphael, Michelangelo, to rebuild Rome in both stone and spirit. The result was a city transformed into a living museum of genius. The Vatican became the new Athens, where theology met architecture and faith met form. Bramante designed St. Peter's Basilica, a monument that fused geometry with grace. Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling, turning plaster into poetry. Raphael filled the papal chambers with frescoes that depicted philosophy, faith, and humanity in perfect balance. Rome was not merely rebuilt, it was resurrected. Its ruins became foundations for new masterpieces. Its pagan past was reborn through Christian art. The city became a paradox of holiness and humanity, splendor and sin. Artists flocked to its streets, scholars to its libraries, pilgrims to its altars. The Eternal City once again became the heart of civilization, this time not through empire, but through inspiration. Yet beneath the marble grandeur lay a reminder of mortality. Rome's glory, like the Renaissance itself, was fragile, built upon ambition, faith, and the fleeting brilliance of human hands. But in that fragility lay its greatness. For every stone, every fresco, every note of music that echoed in its cathedrals declared one truth: beauty is eternal because humanity dares to create it. Before the Renaissance, music in Europe had lived behind the walls of cathedrals, monks chanting in unison, their voices echoing like whispers to heaven. It was sacred, rigid, and confined to divine worship. Yet as the Renaissance dawned, man began to see beauty not just in the divine, but in the human. Art painted emotion, poetry captured thought, and now music began to breathe with life, complexity, and soul. From the 15th century onward, composers began to experiment with sound as painters did with color. They layered melodies, allowing voices to intertwine in intricate polyphony, each line independent yet harmoniously united. The music no longer floated to heaven alone. It spoke to the heart. This was the rebirth of harmony, a new kind of beauty shaped by both science and spirit. In Burgundy, Guillaume Dufay and Gilles Binchois pioneered this movement, blending the solemnity of church chant with the grace of secular song. Their compositions used mathematics to mirror perfection, yet carried a warmth that touched human emotion. The center of music shifted to Italy, where courts of Florence, Ferrara, and Venice became homes for innovation. Here, music escaped the monastery and entered the palace. The educated elite, artists, philosophers, and nobles, saw in it a reflection of their world, rational yet passionate, divine yet human. Every note written was a declaration that sound itself could express ideas beyond words. The Renaissance mind, obsessed with proportion and geometry, saw harmony as the musical equivalent of architectural balance. Music became both science and art, an audible expression of order and beauty. What had once been a prayer became a language. Humanity had found a new way to speak to God, to each other, and to eternity. In this golden age of sound, a constellation of composers emerged, shaping music into the art of emotional storytelling. Among them, none shone brighter than Josquin des Prez, often called the Michelangelo of music. Born in the 1450s, Josquin blended intellect and feeling with effortless genius. His polyphonic works like Ave Maria, Virgo Serena, lifted voices into divine conversation. Listeners felt as if angels themselves were weaving melodies above them. Yet, his music also captured the human heart, its doubts, hopes, and passions. He gave sound to the Renaissance idea that art should reflect the full experience of being alive. Across Europe, composers followed his path. Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, serving in the chapels of Rome, became the musical soul of the Counter-Reformation. His masterpiece, Missa Papae Marcelli, saved sacred music from banishment, proving that beauty could be as holy as obedience. His harmonies shimmered with clarity and reverence, as if each chord was touched by light. In his hands, music became prayer perfected through intellect. Meanwhile, in Venice, the Gabrieli family transformed sound into spectacle. Within the grand acoustics of St. Mark's Basilica, they placed choirs on opposite balconies, creating an echoing dialogue of voices and instruments. This technique, called antiphonal, gave birth to early forms of surround sound. It was breathtaking, physical, immersive. The city of water and light had given birth to music that flowed like both river and flame. But not all Renaissance music was sacred. Composers also wrote madrigals, secular songs celebrating love, nature, and wit. In England, Thomas Morley and John Dowland set poetry to melody, crafting works that mirrored the elegance of Elizabethan thought. Their music filled courts, gardens, and hearts, proof that the Renaissance spirit could sing as freely of love as of God. The Renaissance transformed not just what music was, but how it was understood. For the first time in history, music became a discipline of study, a blend of mathematics, physics, and emotion. Thinkers like Francino Gaffurio and Heinrich Glerian treated harmony as a divine proportion, an audible reflection of the cosmic order. Just as painters mastered perspective, composers mastered counterpoint, creating depth and sound as artists did with light and space. Instruments, too, evolve alongside ideas. The lute, harpsichord, and viola da gamba filled salons and courts, their delicate tones inviting intimacy. The invention of music printing by Ottaviano Petrucci in 1501 made compositions accessible across Europe. For the first time, a song written in Venice could be performed in Paris or London. Music was no longer bound by geography. It became the universal language of a connected world. This era also witnessed the rise of musical humanism, the belief that music could shape the soul and refine the moral character. Teachers believed that harmony could teach balance, rhythm could teach order, and melody could inspire virtue. In this sense, music became more than entertainment. It became education for the spirit. The Renaissance composer was both craftsman and philosopher. He did not merely create sounds. He sought to capture the harmony of existence itself. Every chord mirrored the human condition: joy and sorrow, hope and despair, faith and doubt. The Renaissance made music not just an art form, but an exploration of meaning, a search for beauty that reflected the divine logic of creation. By the late 1500s, this age of harmony was preparing to give birth to a new revolution: opera, the union of drama, poetry, and music. The Renaissance had awakened man's eyes, hands, and mind, but through music, it awakened his soul. From cathedral choirs to royal courts, Europe now moved to a single rhythm, the rhythm of rebirth. For centuries, the medieval mind had sought truth through faith alone. The universe was believed to be a divine mystery, unchangeable, unquestionable, ordained by heaven. The church told men what to believe, and curiosity was often condemned as heresy. Yet as the Renaissance unfolded, the spirit of humanism whispered a new message, that man could think, question, and understand the world not only through scripture, but through observation and reason. In the universities of Italy and France, scholars began to look beyond Aristotle's ancient teachings. They respected the ancients, but they dared to test them. This was the birth of empiricism, the idea that truth must be proven, not proclaimed. Laboratories replaced altars, experiments replaced dogma. The scientific spirit of the Renaissance was not born in rebellion against God, but in awe of his creation. To study the heavens, the body, or the elements was to read the language in which the Creator had written the universe. The movement began quietly, with mathematicians like Leonardo Fibonacci reviving numerical systems from the Arab world, and physicians like Vesalius dissecting the human form to reveal its hidden perfection. But beneath the surface, a greater revolution was forming, one that would soon challenge the cosmos itself. For the first time, knowledge was being freed from authority. Scholars no longer accepted answers because they were old. They tested them because they were true. The printing press spread scientific diagrams, discoveries, and debates. The rediscovery of ancient Greek texts through Arabic translations brought back forgotten thinkers like Archimedes, Euclid, and Ptolemy, and inspired new ones to question even their heroes. The Renaissance mind was awakening to the realization that truth was not handed down, it was discovered. The human body and the heavens above became the twin mysteries of Renaissance science. In anatomy, Andreas Vesalius, a young Flemish physician, defied centuries of medical authority. For 1,000 years, doctors had followed the writings of Galen, a Roman who had never dissected a human body. Vesalius dared to look for himself. In 1543, he published the Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, with illustrations so detailed they seemed carved from life. Each page was a revelation. The skeleton, the muscles, the organs, all rendered with precision and wonder. His work did more than correct errors. It transformed medicine from speculation into science. At the same time, another man looked upward rather than inward. Nicholas Copernicus, the Polish astronomer, shattered the old illusion that Earth was the center of creation. In his De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, he placed the sun at the center of the universe, with Earth revolving around it. His theory was both elegant and dangerous. It defied not only ancient astronomy, but the authority of the Church itself. Though Copernicus died soon after publishing it, his idea could not die. It had touched the deepest nerve of human understanding. Following him, Johannes Kepler refined the cosmic order further. He discovered that planets moved not in perfect circles, but in ellipses, mathematical precision that revealed a universe guided by laws, not chaos. And then came Galileo Galilei, who lifted his telescope toward the sky and saw the truth with his own eyes. Moons orbiting Jupiter, sunspots blemishing perfection, and the Milky Way teeming with countless stars. His observations confirmed Copernicus's vision and enraged the Church, which demanded silence. But Galileo refused to unsee what he had seen. The universe had expanded, and with it, humanity's place within it. The Renaissance had turned man's gaze from heaven's promises to heaven's reality, and the result was nothing short of rebirth through reason. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Renaissance had done more than inspire curiosity. It had built the framework of modern science itself. Thinkers no longer sought miracles, they sought laws. Nature was not a mystery to fear, but a system to study. The human mind, they realized, could measure, calculate, and predict the workings of creation. Knowledge had become power, and that power was spreading fast. Francis Bacon, an English philosopher, defined the new scientific method: observation, hypothesis, experiment, and proof. He declared that knowledge should serve humanity, that discovery should improve life, not merely decorate thought. Nature, he wrote, to be commanded, must first be obeyed. Across Europe, laboratories began to replace monasteries as centers of learning. The quest for understanding shifted from salvation to truth through evidence. In Italy, Galileo's studies of motion and gravity laid the groundwork for a new physics. In England, William Harvey uncovered the circulation of blood, proving that the heart was a pump, not a mystery. In France, René Descartes turned philosophy into logic, proclaiming cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. Each discovery was a spark. Together, they illuminated an age. The Renaissance did not destroy faith, it transformed it. To many of its greatest minds, understanding creation was itself an act of worship. They believed that reason was the highest gift God had given man, and to use it was to honor the divine. The separation between science and spirit had not yet hardened. They were two halves of the same truth. As Europe stepped into the 17th century, the spirit of inquiry could no longer be contained. The Renaissance had built the foundation of the scientific revolution, an era that would birth Newton, Leibniz, and the modern world. The torch of knowledge, once flickering in the monasteries, now blazed across the continent. Humanity had unlocked a new power, the ability to understand itself and the universe through reason. The stars no longer revolved around man. Man revolved around discovery. The Renaissance spirit of curiosity that had inspired artists and scientists now turned toward the edges of the map. For centuries, Europeans had looked upon the oceans as walls that enclosed their world. But by the 15th century, the compass, the astrolabe, and the courage of dreamers had transformed those walls into gateways. The age of discovery was not born of greed alone. It was born of wonder. The same hunger that drove Da Vinci to dissect a body, or Galileo to study the stars, drove sailors to chase the horizon. Portugal and Spain led the charge. Along the coasts of Africa, Portuguese navigators like Bartolomeu Dias braved storms and fear, finally rounding the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. His voyage proved that the Indian Ocean could be reached by sea, a triumph over legend. 10 years later, Vasco da Gama completed the journey to India, returning with spices worth more than gold. His success reshaped global trade, marking the beginning of a new era where oceans became highways and empires began to rise on waves of commerce. But it was Christopher Columbus who forever changed the human imagination. In 1492, he set sail westward from Spain, believing he could reach Asia by crossing the Atlantic. Instead, he encountered a world unknown to Europe, the Americas. His discovery, though not the first, connected two hemispheres that had been separated for millennia. Crops, animals, diseases, and ideas began to flow between them in what history calls the Columbian Exchange. Potatoes, maize, and tomatoes transformed European diets. Horses, wheat, and iron reshaped the New World. Yet behind this expansion lay both creation and destruction. New trade routes brought wealth to Europe's ports and power to its monarchs, but they also carried conquest, slavery, and exploitation. The Renaissance ideal of knowledge had opened the world, but it had also opened humanity's capacity for dominance. Still, in that fragile balance between discovery and cruelty, the modern world began to take shape. The horizon was no longer the limit, it was the beginning. As the 16th century unfolded, the world became smaller, yet infinitely larger in meaning. The age of exploration wove a global network, a web of exchange connecting Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas. At its heart was the ocean, a restless bridge carrying not just goods, but cultures, languages, and beliefs. In Spain and Portugal, ships departed by the hundreds, their sails white against the dawn. They carried silver from the mines of Potosi, sugar from the Caribbean, and spices from the East Indies. In return, they brought textiles, weapons, and the dream of empire. Europe's wealth multiplied, but so too did its hunger for domination. The great powers, Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands, competed for control of the seas, carving the world into spheres of influence. The Portuguese Empire built trading posts along Africa, India, and Brazil, linking 3 continents. The Spanish Empire, vast and glittering, spanned from Mexico to Peru to the Philippines. Their galleons crossed oceans like floating fortresses, their flags symbols of ambition and faith. But with every triumph came tragedy. Millions of indigenous lives were lost to disease and violence. The transatlantic slave trade, born of greed and empire, chained human beings into commerce itself, a wound that history still bears. And yet, amidst the cruelty, the exchange of ideas flourished. From Arab navigators came maps and mathematics. From China came gunpowder, porcelain, and printing. From Africa came music, rhythm, and spiritual endurance that would later echo through the cultures of the Americas. The Renaissance, once centered in Florence and Venice, had now gone global. The world was no longer a collection of isolated civilizations. It was a single, trembling organism connected by ships, trade winds, and human ambition. The age of exploration revealed both the greatness and the flaws of humanity. It proved that man could reach beyond the known, but also that discovery, without conscience, could devour the soul. The Renaissance dream had always been about expansion, of thought, of art, of possibility. But when Europe's explorers reached the far corners of the earth, that dream met reality in its most complex form. The meeting of civilizations was both a collision and a communion. It brought progress and pain, enlightenment and enslavement. In the Americas, the Aztec and Inca empires, with their own advanced cultures, fell to European steel and smallpox. The conquistadors, Cortés, Pizarro, and others, believed they carried both the sword and the cross, convinced that conquest was divine duty. Gold and souls became their prizes. Entire civilizations were extinguished, but from the ashes rose a new world, mixed, hybrid, and alive with cultural fusion. Spanish cathedrals rose beside Mayan temples. African drums merged with European hymns. Languages blended into creoles and dialects that carried both pain and poetry. In Asia, trade flourished under different terms. The Portuguese and Dutch established ports in India, Indonesia, and Japan, bringing not conquest alone, but commerce and curiosity. Artists in Europe painted scenes inspired by Chinese porcelain and Persian carpets. Scholars studied Arabic texts and Hindu philosophies. The Renaissance had begun as a European awakening, but by the 16th century, it had become a global conversation. This new interconnected world changed the course of history. Wealth from colonies funded the palaces of kings and the studios of artists. The sugar trade fed Europe's appetite. The slave trade darkened its conscience. From the silk markets of Asia to the silver mines of Peru, humanity was learning that every action in one corner of the earth echoed across oceans. The Renaissance had expanded not only knowledge, but responsibility. The age of exploration was both triumph and tragedy, a mirror reflecting the dual nature of mankind. It showed that genius and greed often travel together. Yet it also laid the foundation of a global civilization where ideas, not just armies, would one day conquer. The earth had been measured, mapped, and crossed, but in doing so, humanity had discovered its greatest frontier, itself. The Renaissance did not begin with armies or kings. It began with a thought. It began when humanity rediscovered the power of the mind to question, to reason, and to create. The medieval world had taught that knowledge belonged to the church, that truth was eternal and unchanging. But the thinkers of the Renaissance looked around them and saw a living world in motion, one that invited curiosity rather than fear. They believed that God had given man intellect not to obey blindly, but to understand creation itself. This intellectual awakening found its roots in the revival of Greek and Roman philosophy. The works of Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero, long forgotten in Europe but preserved by Arab scholars, returned through translations and study. These texts sparked a new way of thinking, one that placed the human mind at the center of inquiry. Scholars like Petrarch, often called the father of humanism, argued that wisdom could not come from theology alone. It had to come from history, poetry, and the study of moral life. For him, education was not about memorizing scripture. It was about shaping the soul. Humanism became the philosophical foundation of the Renaissance. It taught that every individual possessed dignity, reason, and potential. In this view, man was not a sinner crawling towards salvation, but a being capable of virtue and greatness. Schools began to teach grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the Studia Humanitatis, or studies of humanity. These subjects trained people not to be obedient servants of faith, but thoughtful citizens of the world. This rebirth of reason gave humanity its new identity. The Renaissance mind believed that to think was to live fully, that truth was not a chain but a light. From Florence to Oxford, from Paris to Padua, the pursuit of wisdom became an act of freedom. The Middle Ages had bowed before mystery. The Renaissance stood upright and asked, why not understand it? The Renaissance produced not only painters and poets, but philosophers who built worlds of ideas. They were the bridge between faith and logic, between the old world and the new. Among them stood Marsilio Ficino, who translated Plato's works into Latin and founded the Platonic Academy in Florence. He believed that all knowledge, scientific, artistic, and spiritual, was connected by divine love. In his view, beauty itself was a pathway to truth, and the human soul was a spark of the eternal. Another towering mind was Giovanni Pico della Mirandola, whose oration on the dignity of man became the manifesto of Renaissance philosophy. In it, Pico declared that man was created with no fixed nature, free to become whatever he chose, beast or angel, ignorant or enlightened. You, O man, he wrote, are the molder and maker of yourself. This declaration of intellectual freedom reshaped how Europe saw itself. It was no longer a world of predetermined fates, but of self-made destinies. In England, Thomas More imagined a perfect society in utopia, where reason guided justice and harmony. In France, Michel de Montaigne invented the essay as a new form of reflection, honest, skeptical, and deeply human. His question, "What do I know?" became the essence of modern doubt. The idea that truth must be tested through experience, not inherited through authority. These thinkers were not rebels against faith, but reformers of thought. They saw God's glory not only in heaven, but in the human mind's capacity to reason. They believed that philosophy could heal ignorance, that education could shape moral strength, and that curiosity itself was sacred. Their writings traveled across borders, inspiring kings and peasants alike. The Renaissance philosopher was not a cloistered monk, but a citizen of the world, a dreamer armed with a pen, challenging the boundaries of belief and knowledge. The Renaissance transformed not only how people thought, but how they learned to think. Education became the instrument through which humanity would sculpt its future. No longer a privilege of the clergy, learning became the foundation of civic life. The humanists believed that a well-educated person was essential to a just society, that wisdom and virtue must grow together. Schools and universities began to reflect this belief. The trivium and quadrivium, grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, were reborn as pathways to both knowledge and morality. In Florence, Vittorino da Feltri established one of the first humanist schools. There, children were taught not only Latin and Greek, but ethics, art, and physical exercise. His motto was simple yet revolutionary: the health of the body and the virtue of the soul. Education was no longer about fear of sin, but the cultivation of character. Across Europe, noble families hired tutors steeped in humanist ideals. Learning became fashionable, an adornment of the mind as much as of the spirit. This transformation extended beyond classrooms. Libraries expanded, filled with manuscripts and printed books that fed the thirst for knowledge. The educated citizen emerged, a man or woman capable of critical thought, civic responsibility, and aesthetic appreciation. Renaissance education aimed to produce not theologians, but complete humans, thinkers, creators, and moral beings. Yet, beneath the beauty of this ideal lay a tension that would define the centuries to come. As knowledge expanded, so too did skepticism. The more people learned, the more they questioned. The Renaissance mind stood on the threshold between faith and reason, its heart pulled in two directions, one toward the divine, the other toward discovery. But it was precisely in that tension that greatness was born. The education of the Renaissance was not simply about filling the mind. It was about awakening the soul. It taught humanity to look inward and outward at once, to see both the mystery of existence and the power of understanding. From these classrooms and studies came not only scholars, but revolutionaries, scientists, and dreamers who would carry the torch of progress into the modern age. The Renaissance was an age of discovery, of art, science, and self. But at its core, it was also an age of faith rediscovered. Religion did not vanish with the coming of humanism. It transformed. Medieval Christianity had painted God as a distant ruler, a divine monarch reigning from heaven, with humanity kneeling far below. But the thinkers and artists of the Renaissance began to see the divine not as unreachable, but as reflected in man himself. Humanists believed that if man was created in God's image, then understanding humanity was a form of worship. This idea was revolutionary. It did not reject faith, it deepened it. Scholars like Marsilio Ficino merged Christianity with the philosophy of Plato, seeing divine love as the force that bound the universe together. To love beauty, to seek truth, to create art, all were acts of reverence. The painter's brush, the poet's pen, the mathematician's compass, each became an instrument of devotion. Art reflected this new theology. In medieval cathedrals, saints and angels had floated weightless beyond the reach of man. But in the frescoes of Michelangelo, the faces of prophets were human, their muscles tensed with divine vitality. In Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, Jesus and his disciples were not remote icons. They were men caught in a moment of human emotion, filled with confusion, fear, and love. The sacred became personal, the infinite made intimate. This reimagining of God did not weaken religion, it made it human. It taught that spirituality was not confined to the altar. It was everywhere, in the study of nature, in the search for justice, in the courage to question. The Renaissance did not kill faith. It gave it a soul that could think, dream, and create. But every light casts a shadow. As faith became personal, it also became dangerous. The same curiosity that fueled discovery led many to question not just the church's corruption, but its authority itself. Across Europe, whispers of doubt turned into storms of reform. The printing press spread the Bible into every home. Scholars began to interpret Scripture in their own languages. For the first time, truth no longer flowed from the pulpit downward. It rose from the people upward. The church, long accustomed to absolute control, saw this freedom as rebellion. To question dogma was to challenge divine order. Giordano Bruno, a Dominican friar, dared to teach that the universe was infinite, filled with countless worlds, each reflecting God's glory. He preached that the cosmos was not centered on Earth, but on the boundless imagination of the Creator. For such audacity, he was burned alive in 1600. His flames marked the price of free thought. Others, like Erasmus of Rotterdam, sought reform through gentler means. His praise of folly mocked corruption among priests and popes with wit rather than anger. He dreamed of a Christianity purified through education and compassion. But his friend Martin Luther would strike a harsher blow. When Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in 1517, he began the Reformation, a spiritual revolution that split Christendom forever. The Renaissance had given men minds capable of questioning everything, even heaven. The church responded with the Inquisition, the Index of Forbidden Books, and the Counter-Reformation. Yet, even persecution could not stop the tide. Faith had changed shape. It was no longer chained to the authority of Rome. It now lived in every conscience, every heart that dared to seek God in its own way. The age of heresy was, in truth, the age of spiritual freedom. Humanity was learning that even divine truth must endure the test of reason. The Renaissance reshaped religion not by destroying it, but by reawakening its essence. Artists, philosophers, and theologians sought harmony between the eternal and the earthly, between reason and revelation. In this pursuit, they created a new understanding of the divine, one vast enough to embrace both heaven and the human heart. Theologians like Nicholas of Cusa proposed that God was beyond comprehension, yet reflected in all things. A circle whose center was everywhere and circumference nowhere. This idea inspired generations of thinkers to view science and faith not as enemies, but as partners in the quest for truth. To study nature was to read the second book of God, the one written not in scripture, but in stars, rivers, and bones. Art continued this dialogue between sacred and human. Raphael's School of Athens, painted in the Vatican itself, placed pagan philosophers in the halls of the church, a daring symbol of unity between classical wisdom and Christian faith. In Michelangelo's creation of Adam, God does not command man from afar. He reaches out, almost touching him, as if divine and human were mirrors of one another. That single space between their fingers became the most powerful symbol of the Renaissance, the space where God and man meet in understanding. Music, too, echoed this union. Composers like Palestrina and Lassus turned worship into harmony, layering human voices into soundscapes that lifted the soul beyond dogma. Even architecture preached philosophy. Cathedrals filled with light and proportion became metaphors for divine order expressed through human design. By the end of the 16th century, faith had survived its greatest trial. The Renaissance had not destroyed belief, it had purified it. God was no longer confined to stone walls or Latin texts. He lived in the intellect, the imagination, and the conscience of every individual. The sacred had become infinite, and humanity had learned the greatest lesson of all, that the image of God is not only painted in the heavens, it is reflected in the face of man. Art was the heart through which the Renaissance breathed. If philosophy gave it thought and science gave it reason, art gave it face. The painters, sculptors, and architects of the 15th and 16th centuries did not simply imitate reality. They reinvented it. For the first time since antiquity, man began to see beauty not as sin, but as a reflection of the divine. The brush became an instrument of revelation. Marble became a voice that spoke of eternity through human form. In the early Renaissance, artists like Giotto di Bondone and Masaccio broke from medieval flatness, giving life and depth to sacred scenes. They discovered perspective, the geometry of vision, allowing viewers to step into the painting itself. With each line and shadow, the world grew three-dimensional, alive. Light and anatomy became new tools of expression. Donatello, the sculptor, carved human emotion into stone, his David standing not as a symbol of royalty, but of youthful courage. By the time of Leonardo da Vinci, art had merged with science. His paintings like The Last Supper and Mona Lisa captured something no artist had before, the soul behind the eyes. Leonardo studied muscles, bones, and light with obsessive precision, believing that to depict life truthfully was to understand God's design. Every fold of fabric, every gesture of the hand carried meaning. The Mona Lisa's smile remains the Renaissance itself, mysterious, intelligent, infinite. Art was no longer merely decorative. It was philosophy in color and form. It questioned, celebrated, and immortalized. The church, the state, and the merchant all became patrons of genius, funding creations that merged devotion with glory. Through art, the Renaissance turned invisible thought into visible beauty, transforming walls and canvases into mirrors of the human condition. If painters captured the light of the Renaissance, sculptors captured its soul. In marble and bronze, they revealed the divine perfection of the human body. To them, form was not mere flesh, it was spirit materialized. Every muscle, every curve, every expression carried the weight of philosophy. To sculpt was to speak the silent language of being. At the forefront stood Michelangelo Buonarroti, the titan whose hands shaped immortality itself. His David, carved from a single flawed block of marble, stood as a symbol of human potential, the moment before triumph, the perfect balance between tension and grace. In his Pietà, the Virgin Mary cradles her son with sorrow too profound for words, her face serene yet infinite in pain. And in the Sistine Chapel, he turned paint into prophecy, the ceiling an ocean of divine creation and human struggle. The creation of Adam, where God's finger nearly touches man's, became the ultimate metaphor for Renaissance humanism, the spark of divinity within humanity. But Michelangelo was not alone. Donatello, his predecessor, had already breathed realism into bronze. Ghiberti's bronze doors of Florence's baptistry, called the Gates of Paradise by Michelangelo himself, told biblical stories with such grace and motion that they seemed alive. Later, Benvenuto Cellini and Giambologna filled piazzas with sculptures of mythic dynamism, capturing the Renaissance's fascination with motion, anatomy, and the heroic. Sculpture, in this era, became a dialogue between body and soul, matter and meaning. Artists believed that marble already contained the figure within. It was their task to liberate it. This act of creation mirrored the Renaissance idea itself, that knowledge, beauty, and truth already existed in the world, waiting to be freed by the hand and mind of man. In every chisel mark, in every polished vein of stone, these artists carved eternity. Their work still stands as testimony that beauty can transcend time, and that the human form, when touched by genius, becomes divine. That if painting captured the Renaissance's heart and sculpture its body, architecture gave it form. It turned philosophy into space, geometry into awe. The cathedrals and palaces of this era were not built merely to impress. They were designed to express harmony, proportion, and divine order. In their domes and arches, the Renaissance found the physical embodiment of its faith in reason and beauty. The movement began with Filippo Brunelleschi, whose dome for Florence's cathedral remains one of the greatest feats of engineering in human history. Without scaffolding, without modern tools, Brunelleschi built a structure that defied both gravity and imagination. It was not merely a roof over a city. It was a crown for civilization. His mastery of mathematics and perspective transformed architecture into science. Every brick, every curve was a calculation of grace. In Rome, Donato Bramante and later Michelangelo carried this vision to its zenith. Bramante's design for St. Peter's Basilica sought to recreate the perfection of God's universe in stone. A circle within a cross, a harmony of heaven and earth. When Michelangelo took over the project, he transformed it into something more powerful. The union of intellect and emotion, of divine geometry and human ambition. The dome of St. Peter's became a symbol of both faith and ingenuity, a man-made sky rising toward the real one. Palaces and public buildings reflected this same ideal. In Venice, Andrea Palladio redefined architecture through balance and symmetry, his villas merging simplicity with grandeur. His influence would travel far beyond Italy, shaping European and even American architecture centuries later. The Renaissance architect was both artist and engineer, philosopher and mathematician. He built not just for kings or popes, but for eternity. Every column spoke of logic, every vault of balance, every facade of the belief that beauty itself was proof of divine order. When the sun set on the Renaissance, its cities still stood radiant, cathedrals glowing like prayers in stone, piazzas unfolding like open books of history. Through architecture, the Renaissance achieved its ultimate goal. It made heaven visible on earth. The Renaissance was born under the golden Tuscan sky, but its brilliance could not be contained within the narrow valleys of Italy. Like sunlight spilling over mountain peaks, its glow began to spread, slowly at first, then with unstoppable force, across the kingdoms of Europe. Ideas crossed borders more easily than armies. Artists, merchants, and scholars became messengers of a new age. The rebirth that had begun in Florence now traveled through Venice's ports, over the Alps, and into France, England, Germany, and beyond. The secret to this expansion was not conquest, but communication. The invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 changed history more profoundly than any sword or empire. For the first time, books were no longer treasures locked in monasteries. They were mirrors of the mind, available to anyone who could read. Knowledge multiplied. Bibles, scientific texts, and works of philosophy circulated through cities and villages, carrying the Renaissance spirit to people who had never seen Florence or Rome. Students from across Europe flocked to Italian universities, where they studied under humanist teachers and carried those lessons home. Merchants returned from Venice and Genoa not just with spices and silk, but with stories of art, architecture, and ideas. In the courts of France and England, kings and queens invited Italian painters and scholars to bring this new vision of beauty and reason. The Renaissance was not simply exported. It was translated, adapted to the soul of each nation it touched. By the late 15th century, a cultural network had formed across the continent. Ideas traveled faster than ever, weaving Europe into a single intellectual fabric. What had begun as a local awakening had become a continental revolution, not through violence, but through the quiet power of imagination and education. The world had entered an era where thought itself became the greatest traveler. As the Renaissance crossed the Alps, it changed character. In Italy, art had celebrated ideal beauty and human perfection. In the north, Flanders, Germany, and the Low Countries, it turned inward, seeking truth not in grandeur, but in detail, realism, and spiritual depth. The Northern Renaissance was more intimate, more reflective. It was a mirror not of gods, but of people, their homes, their prayers, their silent moments between sin and salvation. In the cities of Bruges and Ghent, artists like Jan van Eyck mastered the art of oil painting, creating images that shimmered with light and texture. His Arnolfini portrait revealed a new kind of vision. Every reflection, every candle flame, every fold of fabric painted with reverence. Where Italian artists sculpted bodies, Northern painters sculpted light itself. The printing press found its truest home in the North, where scholars like Desiderius Erasmus used it to spread humanist thought. Erasmus called for a return to simple, moral Christianity, faith guided by reason rather than ritual. His words reached every corner of Europe, inspiring reformers and thinkers alike. Meanwhile, in Germany, the Dürer family gave birth to Albrecht Dürer, a man whose genius rivaled Leonardo's. Painter, engraver, mathematician, and philosopher, Dürer fused Italian idealism with Northern precision. His self-portraits spoke of pride, intellect, and humanity, a declaration that the artist himself was no longer a servant, but a creator. The Northern Renaissance brought beauty to the ordinary. Domestic interiors, humble meals, and quiet landscapes became sacred subjects. Art no longer served only kings or popes, it served life itself. While Italy celebrated man as divine, the North celebrated divinity in man's daily world. Together, they completed the Renaissance vision of what it meant to be fully human. In the 16th century, the flame of the Renaissance reached the kingdoms of England and France, igniting a transformation of art, literature, and intellect that reshaped Western culture. France, under King Francis I, became a sanctuary for Italian genius. The king invited Leonardo da Vinci himself to his court, where the master spent his final years painting, designing, and dreaming. His presence in France symbolized the passing of the Renaissance torch from Italy to the wider world. French chateaux like Chambord blended Gothic grace with classical symmetry, a visual harmony of two worlds medieval and modern. England's awakening came later, but when it arrived, it blazed with brilliance. The reign of Elizabeth I ushered in a cultural golden age that rivaled the glory of Florence. English humanism found its voice not on canvas, but on the stage and the page. William Shakespeare, the poet of the world, turned the Renaissance fascination with human nature into living poetry. His characters, Hamlet, Lear, Juliet, Othello, were no longer symbols or saints, but souls. He gave humanity its truest reflection, flawed, passionate, and infinite in complexity. Alongside him, thinkers like Sir Francis Bacon and Thomas More shaped philosophy and governance. Bacon's scientific method laid the foundation for modern inquiry, while More's utopia envisioned a society governed by reason and justice. Music, too, flourished under Thomas Tallis and William Byrd, whose compositions filled cathedrals with harmonies that seemed to bridge earth and heaven. Across France and England, art and intellect became tools of identity. Monarchs used culture as diplomacy. Scholars used it as liberation. The Renaissance ideal, that humanity could reach perfection through learning and creativity, became the beating heart of European civilization. By the early 17th century, the movement that had begun with a handful of dreamers in Italy had transformed an entire continent. The Renaissance had completed its greatest journey, from the hands of Italian artists to the minds of the world. Europe was no longer medieval. It was modern, by the dawn of the 17th century. The bright flame that had illuminated Europe for 200 years began to fade, not in defeat, but in transformation. The Renaissance, that miraculous rebirth of thought, art, and spirit, had fulfilled its purpose. It had awakened the human mind from centuries of sleep and shown it the boundless horizon of possibility. Yet, as the world moved forward, new questions arose. Questions too vast even for the dreamers of Florence and Rome. The beauty that had once defined truth now faced the cold precision of science. The age of human wonder gave way to the age of reason. Where Leonardo had painted mystery, Galileo measured motion. Where Michelangelo carved perfection, Newton calculated gravity. The universe that once glowed with divine light was now seen through lenses and equations. It was not a loss of faith, it was a change of language. Humanity no longer sought miracles from heaven. It sought laws of nature written in the same divine logic that had shaped the stars. Yet, as art and science drifted apart, the legacy of the Renaissance endured in every brushstroke, every instrument, every book. Its thinkers had taught Europe how to question and to see. Its artists had taught mankind how to feel. Its scientists had taught the world how to prove. Even as the movement dissolved into the coming Baroque era, the Renaissance remained the soul beneath the surface, a pulse that still beat in every cathedral, every poem, every experiment. The world it left behind was forever changed. Nations had formed, printing had conquered illiteracy, trade had bound continents together, and man had learned to look at both God and himself with new eyes. The Middle Ages were gone. Humanity had entered the modern age, and the Renaissance was the bridge that carried it there. To understand the true legacy of the Renaissance is to understand the birth of modern humanity. Before it, Europe had been a collection of kingdoms and faiths bound by obedience. After it, it became a civilization bound by imagination. The Renaissance gave humanity the courage to ask why, and the humility to search for the answer. Its influence reached far beyond art and architecture. It reshaped politics, religion, education, and even identity. The concept of the individual, of man as a thinking, feeling, creating being was the Renaissance's greatest invention. The painter who signed his canvas, the writer who spoke in his own voice, the scientist who dared to defy authority, all were children of this rebirth. Every modern artist, philosopher, and innovator walks in their shadow. In education, the humanist model of learning became the foundation for universities across the world. In science, the methods born from Renaissance curiosity evolved into the scientific method that still guides discovery today. In art, the principles of proportion, balance, and perspective became eternal laws of beauty. Even in politics, the Renaissance reshaped governance. Thinkers like Machiavelli examined power not as divine right, but as human strategy, laying the groundwork for modern political thought. The Renaissance also gave birth to a paradox. It celebrated human greatness even as it revealed human frailty. Its thinkers knew that knowledge could build cathedrals or cannons, inspire creation or conquest. Yet they believed, perhaps naively, perhaps nobly, that reason and beauty would guide humanity toward light. That faith, more than any doctrine, became the Renaissance's enduring flame. Every age since has carried a piece of its vision. Every scientist searching for truth, every artist chasing perfection, every philosopher daring to doubt, all echo the same spirit born 5 centuries ago in the streets of Florence, the belief that human potential is infinite. Those centuries have passed. The Renaissance has never truly ended. Its art still breathes in museums. Its architecture still towers above cities. Its philosophy still whispers in the minds of dreamers. It was more than a period, it was a promise. The promise that humanity, no matter how lost, can always begin again. From the ashes of the medieval world, the Renaissance taught that creation is the highest form of worship. When Leonardo da Vinci sketched his flying machines, he was not just imagining flight. He was proving that the human mind could mirror the divine. When Michelangelo carved David, he was not just sculpting a hero. He was sculpting the courage of mankind itself. When Galileo turned his telescope to the heavens, he did not diminish God. He revealed the vastness of his creation. Every act of genius during this era was a declaration of faith, not in superstition, but in the sacred spark of the human spirit. The Renaissance lives on wherever beauty and truth meet. In every university lecture, in every scientific breakthrough, in every painting that moves a soul, its pulse can still be felt. The modern world, with its technology, democracy, and endless hunger for discovery, is built upon its foundations. We are, in essence, the children of its light. As the 16th century gave way to the 17th, Europe's heart turned toward new horizons, toward revolutions, empires, and machines. But the Renaissance had given humanity something that would outlast all those things. The belief that knowledge, art, and faith could coexist, that reason could serve love, and that beauty was not a luxury, but a path to understanding existence itself. And so, the Renaissance did not die, it transformed. Its spirit continues wherever the mind dares to create, wherever the heart seeks meaning, and wherever the soul reaches for truth. It is not just a chapter in history, it is history's heartbeat. And so, the story of the Renaissance comes to its close, not as an ending, but as a beginning that never truly ended. The Renaissance, the moment humanity looked at itself and saw God looking back. Over these 20 chapters, we witnessed the rebirth of humanity. We saw how the courage to think reshaped the world, how a painter's brush could change faith, how a scientist's lens could redefine the universe, and how a philosopher's words could free the soul. From Florence's domes to England's theaters, from the writings of Erasmus to the telescopes of Galileo, the Renaissance taught us the greatest lesson of all, that knowledge is sacred, beauty is eternal, and truth is worth every risk. It showed us that progress is not made by conquest, but by curiosity, that every age of darkness carries within it the seed of light, and that within every one of us lies the same divine spark that once moved Da Vinci's hand, Michelangelo's chisel, and Shakespeare's pen. The Renaissance was not just Europe's story, it is our story. Because every time we dare to imagine, to create, to question, we become part of that eternal rebirth. Thank you for watching History Teller YT. If you've traveled through these chapters with us, remember, history is not a collection of dead years. It is the living memory of our humanity. Stay with us, because more stories await. Stories of civilizations that rose, fell, and changed the world forever. Subscribe, return, and keep your heart open to the past. Because every time we look back, we find the light that leads us forward.